From KVUE News in Austin, you're watching Texas This Week with Ashley Goudeau.
Thank you for watching Texas This Week. New reports detail Texas leaders pushing to establish chapters of the late Charlie Kirk's Turing Point USA at high schools across the state. And political campaigns are ramping up ahead of the primaries. We're going to have those stories for you in just a minute. But first, let's get to the 3 things you need to know in Texas politics. Texas politicians celebrated Thanksgiving by serving the community this week. U.S. Senator John Cornyn and Austin Mayor Kurt Watson volunteered with the Central Texas Food Bank at a food distribution event on Monday. And Governor Greg Abbott and First Lady Cecilia Abbott volunteered with Meals on Wheels Central Texas on Thanksgiving Day. Texas Attorney General Ken Paxton is suing the state's Department of Housing and Community Affairs, claiming some of the agency's rules discriminate against religious organizations. According to Paxton, in order for religious groups to get money for homeless and housing programs, they have to agree that those programs won't include religious activities. Paxton calls it unconstitutional, saying the department is forcing people to censor their beliefs. Now, we reached out to the agency but have not heard back. Rules for the state's new education savings account program are closer to being set in stone. On Tuesday, acting state comptroller Kelly Hancock announced the final rules. They'll be finalized in mid-January. Families can start applying for the program on February 4th, 2026, ahead of the 2026-2027 school year. Students in the program will get about $10,000 a year from the state to help pay private school tuition, $30,000 for students with disabilities. A new report from the Texas Tribune found the head of the Texas Education Agency met with leaders of the late Charlie Kirk's Turing Point USA about bringing chapters to every Texas high school and college campus. I talked with Jaden Edison, public education reporter for the Texas Tribune, about what he learned. So let's dive right into it. Tell us exactly what you found and how you found this out.
Yeah, a long story. We can sit here all day, but nonetheless, very interesting. I think what happened is that more recently, sometime earlier in the month of November, the Turning Point USA senior director of major gifts, a guy named Josh Tifo, reached out to the education commissioner's administrative assistant, kind of asking questions, specifically framed it like, when would the commissioner like to meet with me, right? Which to me kind of insinuated that perhaps there's a chance that maybe they had met before or there had been some kind of interest in that. And so what happened is that over the course of several weeks, they communicated, they worked, and then ultimately the commissioner met with this individual in person in Austin. And the subject of that conversation was finding out a way to form a partnership potentially to establish Turning Point USA chapters, across as many high schools in Texas as possible, right? It's a national initiative we've seen in places like Oklahoma and Florida, more recently Tennessee as well. And as we know, Turning Point USA, as you mentioned, is the conservative kind of youth advocacy group founded by the late activist, right-wing activist Charlie Kirk. And so, at face value, right, it's an organization that really, promotes itself as, about promoting free speech and things of that nature. But also we know that, on college campuses, is run into a lot of controversy, for the way it's presented itself and the way it's interacted with perhaps, say university professors who it deems, too liberal or progressive. So certainly interesting there. But the meeting was interesting given that the commissioner met with him face to face, at a time as we're seeing a push further to the political right here in Texas.
And not only that, you're seeing a push from state leaders, right, to have more chapters of this organization. Talk to us about Dan Patrick and the big donation he made.
Yeah, no, it's super interesting. And so the timing of this kind of works out interesting because, this meeting happens, early in November. And 4 days later, Lieutenant Governor Dan Patrick, puts out a social media post saying he's going to pledge $1 million in his campaign funds to kind of bring this effort to life. And so, again, I'm not saying that there's a connection there, but certainly the timeline happened and played out the way it did. And so that's certainly interesting. And to your, as you just mentioned, right, we are seeing a push by, Republican leaders in this state who feel like public schools, reflect too much of a liberal, bias. But where this is different and where this is interesting is that certainly the education commissioner, is appointed by Governor Greg Abbott, who is a Republican. But there is a reasonable, expectation when you talk to parents and families who feel that education should be apolitical. And so the commissioner, meeting with a national organization with such strong political conservative kind of right-wing ties is kind of, raises eyebrows and questions from people interested in Texas education.
I think another thing that's really interesting about all of this is that there's been so many more restrictions placed on schools, right? In terms of the types of clubs they can have. I think one of the things you mentioned in your article talks about voter registration, but teachers can no longer advocate for students to register to vote. That was included in some of the bills, some of the legislation that passed during the past legislative session and the session before that. Talk to us about how that kind of conflicts if you want to bring such an organization like this into schools.
I think you hit the nail right on the head, right? When you think about it, right? Some of the legislation that passed this past legislative session, right? I'll give you one example, right? Senate Bill 12, which is really a sweeping piece of legislation that seeks to ban all what the state sees as diversity, equity, and inclusion initiatives in schools. That also places a ban on student clubs that have a LGBTQ plus focus, right? And so, you see laws like that. You see laws that, call on schools to put up posters of the Ten Commandments, which obviously have a specific kind of Judeo-Christian kind of Protestant, focus. And then you also see things like, so on one hand, you see, restrictions on the things that can be taught about race and gender and sexual orientation, things of that nature. But you're seeing, more of a focus on aspects of conservative Christianity and things like this, right? Turning Point USA, which we know has a kind of strong, conservative Christian focus. And so certainly those things are running into conflict. That's something that people are talking about.
Let's start with this. All of this back and forth with the Supreme Court over the congressional district map, it's really having an impact on candidates, right?
When the candidate filing period is going on, that time where the rubber really meets the road and candidates have to go ahead and officially declare that they're going to run for office, it's a very personal decision. It's going to completely change their lives. I was talking to a first-time candidate just this week who was really nervous about making their announcement, and that'll be coming up next week. We'll reveal at quorumreport.com who that is. Nice tease there. But point is that it's always something that's hectic and kind of chaotic. And to your point, this really just throws a monkey wrench in all of that, makes it that much harder for candidates who have been on the ballot before when they're trying to figure out what they're going to run for. Some of those congressional candidates might switch districts. Some of them had already said they were going to switch districts, but they might be tempted to switch back if the maps go back in the other direction. And of course, there are the statewide races as well, where we still don't have finality about exactly who all is going to be running for what. Everything from U.S. Senate to, I would also just throw in there, Lieutenant Governor, Comptroller, Railroad Commissioner, etc. Everything is so unsettled right now.
Let's talk about it. It feels like for so many people, the year is winding down after Thanksgiving, right? You're getting ready for the holidays. Things are slowing down. But in the world of politics, things are really, really ramping up as we head towards the primaries. Talk to me about the big issues that you think we're going to be seeing throughout this campaign season. What are candidates going to be running on?
Main thing is going to be the economy followed closely by the economy. That's the number one thing, and there's recognition of that both on the right and the left. You saw the leader of MAGA, President Trump himself, meeting with the Democratic Socialist mayor-to-be in New York, Zohran Mamdani. They were meeting at the White House and basically in agreement that the economy is tough and really specifically that the prices of everything are just too high. When you promise people that you're going to lower prices, President Trump found this out over the last year that that's a really hard thing to do. And if you don't do it instantly the way he was promising, people are going to be angry with you. I mean, think about the fact that you now have Democrats like Senator Alyssa Slotkin from the Midwest. She's been saying that President Trump and his administration are basically in the same position that President Biden and Vice President Harris were in last year when they were essentially trying to tell voters that voters were wrong about how bad they felt their own lives were in the economy. There's one thing you cannot gaslight people about, and that's the prices of things, because they don't need those of us in the news voters don't need us to fact check how high prices are. People can see that for themselves. And so the party that's in power is usually, historically, always punished for that. And the Republicans are in power now in Washington and here in Texas, and I do expect there to be a backlash.
Yeah, talk to me about how you think Texas lawmakers and hopefuls, right, are going to be working that in. How are they going to talk about what they can actually do to help people?
I think at the national level, it's going to be the issues of healthcare. It's going to be the issue of energy. You hear President Trump talking about this a lot, about the idea that he's brought down energy prices, but healthcare prices, that's what Democrats are really going to be putting, front and center for voters. This whole standoff over the government shutdown, the Democrats wanted to talk the whole time about the increases in insurance premiums that are going up. I think it might be somewhat of a tough argument for them because when people start to get those notices, and they have been getting them, that their premiums are going up, in some cases double or triple, a lot of times people will simply blame the insurance companies for that. So Democrats have some work to do to connect the dots for people on that it's Republicans who didn't want to help with the subsidies to try to keep those premiums down. But the fact is, with those prices up, it's not that hard of a case for Democrats to make. But look, Republicans are going to have the resources to make the arguments that they need to make. And of course, they'll try to blunt the damage and contain losses in Texas, if that's what they're up against, by talking about some other things, right? You'll have Governor Abbott and others talking about safety. He is going to be talking about the idea that Democrats are liberals who want to release violent criminals onto the streets and things like that. It sounds like changing the subject for sure, but that's something that has worked in past campaigns.
That's it for this edition of Texas This Week.